is organizational culture anyways? Most organizational leaders know they want a good one, but it's often hard to pin down exactly what it looks like, much less how to shape it. There are as many academic definitions of organizational culture as there are organizational culture scholars. So let's focus on the basics: what it looks like and how you can get the one you want. Here's a simple definition. Organizational culture is how we do things around here, meaning it involves consistent and observable behaviors. If I walk into your organization, sit in your meetings, and watch you doing work, I should be able to get a sense for the culture. This definition is nicely digestible, but it overly simplifies a very complex concept. Organizational culture is also reflected in a company's history and legends. It is reflected in strategy. It is embedded in processes and systems. It is represented in the type of people it employs and those that it services. It involves the norms and habits of its workers. However, all these behaviors represent something more implicit: shared organizational values and beliefs, and the underlying assumptions that accompany them. These implicit values and beliefs form the basis for that behavior. In modern organizations, culture is also often explicitly expressed through a set of values or a mission statement. In many cases, that explicit description is somewhat idealized, reflecting cultural aspirations rather than reality. But it may nonetheless serve as guiding principles for work behavior. Now, from a skeptic's perspective, culture can actually be thought of as a form of social control, shaping behavior through implicit values and norms, complementing the more explicit rules and incentives. A strong culture really means that employees have generally adopted those values and norms into the way they do things at work. They have fallen into line with that culture. To those of us with an individualistic upbringing, emphasizing independence of thought, this can sometimes feel a bit shady on the surface, some machination to control employee behavior. But if that particular culture aids in achieving the strategic objectives of the organization, it should be thought of as a positive feature, particularly if that culture also includes valuing respect and the well-being of employees. Organizational cultures tend to vary along a number of specific dimensions, although again, there are a number of different frameworks for mapping those dimensions. Any number of consulting firms can introduce you to a tool for assessing your organization's culture. But let's look at one of the classics. Hofstede identifies 6 dimensions of organizational culture. These are patterns of behavior on which organizational cultures tend to vary. Process-oriented organizations focus on technical and bureaucratic routines, whereas results-oriented organizations focus on outcomes. Task-oriented organizations see the organization's responsibility as being primarily about performance, whereas employee-oriented organizations value both well-being and performance. In professional organizational cultures, people identify with the profession, whereas in parochial organizational cultures, people identify with the organization itself. Open organizational cultures welcome and include newcomers and outsiders, relative to closed organizational cultures. Tightly controlled organizations have more formality and rules than loosely controlled organizations. Finally, pragmatic organizations are market-driven, compared to normative organizations where process and procedure are more rigid and less sensitive to environmental demands. These 6 cultural dimensions capture a significant portion of the broad variation between organizations. Yet, at their core, they reflect the organization's underlying beliefs and value priorities. The competing values framework is another, simpler model of cultural dimensions. This approach suggests that there are 2 core value dimensions that shape the cultural orientation of an organization: control versus flexibility, and an internal versus external focus. Organizations that are flexible and internally focused have a human relations culture. They achieve success through cohesion and morale, emphasizing training and development, as well as open communication and participatory decision-making. Organizations that are flexible and externally focused have an open systems culture. They achieve success through innovation and development, emphasizing adaptability and a future-focused vision. Organizations that are controlled and internally focused have a process-focused culture. They succeed through stability and control, characterized by information flow and communication, and evidence-based decision-making. Lastly, Organizations that are controlled and externally focused have a rational culture. They achieve success through efficiency and productivity, emphasizing goal attainment and directive, centralized communications. Importantly, although some cultural dimensions do, on average, yield better performance, the key is not to have a specific type of culture, but rather to have a culture that supports the strategy of the organization. The organizational culture must work in tandem with the organizational strategy. Culture only improves organizational performance when it aligns with the organizational strategy to generate a competitive advantage. For example, the strategic goals of a household goods retailer are best supported by a people-oriented culture. In contrast, the strategic goals of a consulting firm are likely better supported by cultural stability and an outcome orientation. However, when culture and strategy are not aligned, the culture can undermine productivity. Well-known management consultant Peter Drucker is credited with saying, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." This saying illustrates in no uncertain terms that even the best organizational strategy can be easily overwhelmed by a poorly aligned organizational culture. This really emphasizes the importance of your organization's culture as a critical facilitating or inhibiting factor for performance. But of course, this is further complicated by the fact that your team can have a culture of its own that is distinct from the organization's, and that a large organization may have numerous subcultures. Again, these may be functional for the specific team objectives, but can nonetheless bump heads when collaboration and cooperation between work units is required. Once you have determined what type of culture will support your strategic objectives, either at the team level or the organizational level, the hard part begins, actually trying to shape that culture. Shaping an organizational culture and managing organizational change more broadly is a complicated topic, and a complete understanding of this literature is beyond the scope of what we can accomplish here. Instead, we can take a practical approach to shaping culture. This approach recognizes that we cannot directly influence the values and beliefs of employees. However, we can facilitate their adoption by altering the structure and processes used in the organization in a way that encourages behaviors consistent with that idealized culture. Essentially, we can shape culture by embedding culturally consistent behavior. Before you start considering how to shape culture, make sure you know what you want. What is the specific culture and values that will help support your strategic objectives? Once you know what that ideal is, consider the various levers that help to shape employee behavior. First, what is being modeled? What is the leadership doing to embody that cultural ideal? How might that be changed to better exhibit cultural goals? Second, what is expected? Is the ideal being communicated effectively and consistently? Do employees know what that means for their daily work? Third, who is equipped? Do your employees actually have the capability to achieve those expectations? Or is training required? Fourth, what is being reinforced? Rewards, even informal rewards like manager recognition, are powerful for shaping employee focus. Fifth, what are the habits? Is the way we do things around here consistent with the ideal culture? Or do those habits need to be unfrozen, changed, and refrozen? Sixth, what are the enablers? Are there structural or procedural features of the organization that prevent expression of the culture? Or do those features support that culture? For example, is there bureaucracy that inhibits open-mindedness and innovation? Seventh, what is being measured? What do supervisors rate on an appraisal form? What are the selection criteria? These all shape culture, both directly by incentivizing behavior, but also by signaling what is really important to the organization. Once you have shaped a culture that works with your strategy, you must sustain it. One aspect of this is replicating that culture in new employees and team members, what we often talk about as the socialization process. Again, socialization may sound a bit like onboarding, or worse, brainwashing. But more positively, it is about bringing new employees into the fold and communicating the otherwise unspoken values and expectations of behavior, helping them learn the ropes. Good socialization practices help to reduce uncertainty for new employees during a highly uncertain time in their career. The basic socialization process looks a bit like a simple change management process, involving unfreezing, some change to the employee's way of doing things, and then refreezing. In the unfreezing phase, we attempt to detach employees from their previous habits and values, illustrating that the employee's old way of doing things is not valued and that the organization's way of doing things is critical. The organizational values and norms of behavior are then communicated to the employees, including the organization's goals, the preferred means by which these goals can be obtained, the responsibilities of the employee, the patterns of behavior expected in their role, and the organizational expectations of identity and integrity, how to represent who we are. Refreezing then requires embedding those new ideals into everyday practice. It requires systems and processes, the levers we discussed earlier, to support and reinforce that culture. We can also consider socialization with greater focus on practical requirements. For example, the framework by Pascal involves 7 key features. First, selection should be geared toward encouraging applicants that will fit the culture and discouraging applicants that will not fit. This can go awry if the culture is toxic or tied to a particular demographic, for example, a masculine culture. But it is valuable for socializing employees into positive cultures. Second, early employment experiences should unfreeze existing values and habits to make room for the new way of doing things. Managers might promote humility-inducing experiences, leading employees to question their own understanding of how things should be done, and opening them up to the organization's culture. Third, actually getting down to the business of doing work helps to cement the effectiveness of the new way of operating. Doing the work in a way that is consistent with the culture begins to shape new employee habits. Fourth, the systems and processes must support the culture. Remember your cultural levers. For example, the performance appraisal and reward systems should reflect organizational value priorities. Fifth, shaping and communicating organizational values gives employees a basis for their organizational commitment and identity, and a basis for their willingness to make personal sacrifices for their job. Sixth, further embed those values with narratives of the organization's history. Folklore about the founders gives an essential, stable quality to the culture and values of the organization. Finally, provide successful role models for success. Show employees that embodying those cultural values is positively regarded, opening up a fast track for career advancement. It is rare to find an organization with all 7 features working well in tandem, so this framework offers a critical test of how well your organization is socializing employees. Armed with these practical frameworks for leveraging culture and socialization, you can begin to embed a team culture that will work with your strategic objectives rather than against them.